basically taught us English via Bavarian. Like this Bavarian word is exactly like the English one, so we learned via the Bavarian dialect. We learned it.
So in Austrian German is more elaborate, let's say.
Austrian German is again a different dialect. That
And
stretches,
I guess different ones.
Like
And I guess there's different dialects.
Yeah. It's really the North Germans cannot understand the heavy Austrian dialect, and the Austrians cannot understand the heavy North German dialect.
But Bavaria is kind of close, so it's...
They are kind of familiar.
Where in Austria are you from?
Linz. Like it's on the Danube, on the way to Vienna.
Right. I've been a few times. I have friends in Innsbruck. I love it. It's really...
Yul wants to move to Innsbruck.
Yeah, when they're thinking it will be this village, and the architecture of school is very good, very good architects, and nobody knows them. It's crazy. Very nice.
No, I mean in the German-speaking area, it's quite famous.
But I mean outside, you know.
Yeah,
I'm surprised.
There are some very good teachers that are very famous in the German-speaking area again. So it attracts
like
a lot of attention. So.
You're on a knife now.
Should I take this out or do I? The other day I saw a guy sleeping in a chonja with this and like this.
Let's wait off and then start.
Shall we check YouTube whether somebody is there? They should say hi.
There are 8.
Comment.
Can you? You know.
They can live comment or something. Or maybe
but there's no way to know how many people are watching.
We are streaming the screen here, so I mean we can.
But do we know that sound works now?
Yeah, so I checked.
Okay.
So you're streaming without a camera, that's what you mean? You're streaming without the camera. You're streaming directly from the computer.
So
or from here?
Yeah, I'll show you how it looks like.
From the computer's camera.
So for this one, but
technology, Mark, technology.
Yeah, technology, Mark.
It's actually from the CCTV. So.
Actually, there is no camera. YouTube hacks into every available CCTV.
Yeah. So it works like this.
There's 2 screens.
Right. But then when you start the lecture, I'll change the setting.
So there's always a small one and a big one.
Yeah. So the screen will be big and then your face will be smaller.
Better. Nothing
too better.
We're not missing anything.
Okay. So
but then it doesn't make sense to point at this thing.
Right. That was my.
Then you have to point with the mouse.
And there's a delay also.
Yeah, there's some delay. Okay.
We could make things happen between this delay, like interferences or something.
Shall we wait a little more? Did some people apply to come today, or?
There were, but not that many because he didn't want to.
No, I thought if there was too many people, I will catch something.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we kind of.
But you said 10.
No? He's already in the age group of.
There were 6 or 7.
Risky age group.
And then we kind of cut it. Yeah, I think that's okay.
My lecture is kind of long though. So when you feel like just cut it and keep me out.
I'm gonna walk out.
We're just gonna leave.
Me too.
All right.
I'm so sick of this topic actually.
So probably we don't have to introduce, right? We can just start.
No, introduce. Do your work, man.
Yeah. Okay. Just start. Then let me change the setting.
No, but you'll say something. No, I just start like that.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'll say
it's a little
something.
bit odd, no?
All right. All right. I'll say something.
Hello.
Yeah,
Hello. I'm Hangmin.
Have a seat.
So much friends.
He has friends.
I don't have any friends.
I think it's probably part of a membership or something. It's like Friends BMD or something.
I told you that it's so nice.
Yeah. People should know.
Okay.
Thanks for the restroom.
Yeah. 어딘지 알지?
비밀번호 눌러야 되나?
아니 없어. 안경 바꿨나?
안경? 지난번에도 바꾸긴 했어요. 지난번에.
So welcome to Domansa City Talk by Team X. It seems we have quite many people in the group chat, but it's always several people who talk.
There are now 15 people watching.
That's true.
15.
Hi guys. Say hello to not to those people, to the virtual.
I know, but the camera is this one or that one?
This one.
So it's really wide open.
Yeah.
Okay.
So today we have Marc Brosa, professor at University of Seoul. He recently finished his PhD, relatively recent, right? So he's going to talk about his thesis called Building an Architecture of Everyday Life in South Korea. We had a couple of years ago, we had a chance to join the conference in Oslo, right? So
Yeah.
was
I organized it.
Yes, you organized it. So we went there with Yelena, Hyungmin, right? Valerie, right? So it was quite good. So I kind of know what Marc has been doing. It's very interesting to see how Marc sees this, let's say, apartment culture of South Korea as part of the, or as type of a mass housing, let's say, production, which also frames the living culture or the life of our let's say daily lives. So I think this is very interesting, and also it goes beyond, let's say, the architectural, let's say, boundary. That it also includes all these social aspects that or cultural aspects as well, that we have to address or think about at least. Marc, he will be the global studio curator for the next Seoul Biennale, right? So I don't know.
I'm thinking about it.
You're still thinking about it, which is understandable. well, I shouldn't say this one. I'm gonna cut it. So, anyways, so I'm gonna pass it to Marc today. He said that it's gonna be a long talk, right? But we will get questions from the floor. But for those of you who are in YouTube live, please leave comments so that we can always give some either feedbacks or the answers to the questions that you have. So please welcome Marc.
Thank you.
This will be the full screen, and then you can just use it.
Okay. Thank you. Well, thank you, Dongwoo and Rafael, for the opportunity of being here today, and thank you for actually hosting us in this little space, because finally we found a place to hang out, and it seems like you guys are having way too much fun with this initiative. So I'm a little jealous that you get this spot. So as Dongwoo said, the presentation features parts of my research that I've been doing the last years. It's been complicated to put these things in a slideshow because it was more of a text. So I hope you bear with sometimes it's not as smooth as I would like it should have been. Basically, I didn't compress the whole research into a slideshow because it was impossible. So I decided to focus on one of the main narratives, or for me the one I'm more interested at the moment, which is this idea of building an architecture of everyday life in South Korea, mass housing states and in Seoul as an instrument of modernization. And as a means of introduction, I would like to unpack the title because it's a little heavy. So basically, I'm using the title to talk about architecture, everyday life, and instrumental modernization are the approaches, and then where South Korea's soul what is the theme mass housing estates, and then when the period of the research, more or less. And I will unfold these things as we go along. But in terms of the approach, I wanted to focus in architecture because I think mass housing has been largely disregarded as banal by the community of architects, and often criticized from a pseudo-sociological or economic or policy perspective, which actually leaves us outside of it. I wanted to question this assumed banality of the mass housing, and to examine, actually to look at it from an architecture point of view and look at the spatial and organizational logics behind their apparent normality. And then also focusing on the everyday life. I was actually very intrigued when Christian here, you talked about the everyday life in your presentation, and I like my ears went up. Because it's something I'm also very interested in, and I use it from 3 points, from 3 aspects. One would be like the idea of the quotidien, the everyday life. Another one would be borrowing more like the discourse in the 60s of gravitating around the idea of the habitat as a criticism of functional planning or functional urbanism after the war. And then the last maybe notion would be the notion of everyday life from Lefebvre, where he saw everyday life as the body of constructions that were implemented to alienate people by the government, and at the same time as a means to overcome that alienation. So I think that the topic of everyday life is very interesting. And then the idea of mass housing as an instrument of modernization, so not as a passive outcome of economic and urbanization processes, but actually as an active means to introduce more like new economic and social structures by the modernizing project of the developmental regime. So my thesis basically is mass housing states in Seoul have been instrumentalized as a powerful means to standardize territorial organization and the production of everyday spaces at different scales by the developmental states project to remake society during the years of fast growth. And this is kind of the urban landscapes we have encountered. This has taken place by adopting planning and architectural concepts, strategies, and formal models from the global diffusion of modern architecture. But these tools have been selected according to their technical and organizational capabilities and stripped from their social or community making ideals. And as a consequence, more than 50% of the population of Seoul lives in mass housing estates, and they are the residential aspiration of the middle class. At the same time, Korean society does not perceive them as an architectural topic, and architects have been largely alienated from their construction. So there's like a gap between the importance they have in society and in the life of people versus how much effort or how much thinking it has been dedicated to them by the discipline. So Apatutanji it's been usually translated as apartment complex, but I like to dwell on the meaning of it because it's a hybrid term that encapsulates this complex process of international diffusion of modern urban architectural concepts and their adaptation to local particularities. Apatu comes from the English apartment house, but it's a contraction. So actually, Apatu is a confusing term because it means both the complex as well as the building and the unit. Everything is Apatu. So it's like it becomes confusing in a sense. And then Tanji is interesting because so we have Apatu from English, and then Tanji, which is a Sino-Korean term, which is composed of 2 ideograms, and one means Tan comes from Chinese sphere, mass, envelope, or limit, and then Chi, which is earth or land. So it's a limited piece of land. That translates very well in Spanish because we usually say apartment, un polígono de vivienda, so a polygon as a limited area bounded. And I think that's interesting. Whereas the legal definition actually is housing estates within a single parcel comprising more than just one building of collective housing, at least 5-story high, and with amenities and facilities according to the number of people living in it. So it has this idea of unitarian piece of land. There's only one owner, built within a like a limited amount of time, and then with facilities. And it's always a very bounded entity, so it's an urban fragment. Why is it important to talk about it? Well, because 50% of the population lives in them, in Seoul, and Seoul is about 10 million people within 600 square kilometers. So according to my poor big data capabilities, in 2013, which is when I developed this, it was about 2,000 apartment complexes, 56,000 apartment buildings, and 1,200,000 housing units, which is a lot. The funny thing though is, I'm from Barcelona myself, if you compare the density of what this gives you compared to the density in Barcelona, it's very similar. So there's always this narrative of, we live in a very small country with a lot of mountains, so there's a limited amount of land, so we have to build high. But then you look at other types of housing morphologies, and it's not true that that's the only way to get it, because you get a lot of wasted empty space around them. So there's a lot of narratives embedded within the argument of apartments, which are not really contrasted. Again, comparing Korea with Spain, Spain is 5 times bigger with about similar population, so population density is 5 times bigger in Korea. It's kind of, for me to understand, to get around it. And then I'm talking morely about the physical context, or the context. This is part of that idea of we live in a small country with a lot of mountains. What is interesting, if you look at the infrastructure of Korea, really creates these long linear metropolitan corridors from Seoul to Daejeon, Daegu, and then Busan. That's kind of the main sort of artery, and if we could connect north, we would go all the way to Pyongyang and then connect to the Silk Route. But I like to see that map with the density of people living in apartments, and you start to see sort of Korea as one single linear city corridor, which I find it very interesting, where you could see like a more urbanized corridor and then leaving the mountains as green areas within it. The Sudeokwan, or metropolitan area, is actually where 50% of the population lives. So that's a source of regional imbalance, and one of the issues driving the expensive price of housing and apartments in Seoul. In terms of socioeconomic context, I love this one because it describes the miracle of the Han River, and I love the steepness of the graph. So basically, after the World War II, and it's well known, Korea was one of the poorest countries in the world, and then we underwent the Korean War, so it became even worse, to the point that by 1959 the GDP per capita was $79. That's kind of very well known fact. And then in the 60s there's the Third Republic. Park Chung-hee puts his foot down, and then things change. And the Vietnam War is usually seen as the beginning of an economic development, because of all the money that came from the U.S. as a repayment for entering the war. And then from here on, it just goes up, like many other things. So the economy, we have the slump of 1997, the big economic crisis with a big dents down, but then it recovers very quickly. And then we have the crisis of 2008, which also impacted quite heavily. But still, right after that, South Korea joined the G20 in 2010. So it's like, it's a well-known fact. But I like to compare that with the housing density later. This is the economic boom is very related to the developmental state, which is it's a concept that has been mostly conceptualized by Western scholars as a capitalist system of government, emerged early in the 20th century in East Asia, mostly from the MITI, which is the export ministry from Japan, and it was developed together with the U.S. as a way to get them out of the economic crisis after the war. And then it's created what is being called this GIS formation, which is other countries from that region following the same model. So we have the four tigers, or four Asian dragons, Singapore, South Korea, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. and then Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines in the 80s, 90s, and then what we're seeing currently is the development of Vietnam and China following similar concepts, which are basically based on it's kind of something between capitalism and socialism, where there's a strong state intervention, so it's not free market, and then together with an extensive regulatory and planning apparatus. So it really borrows aspects from communist planning, really, like the 5-year economic plans and the strong intervention, but at the same time it's highly capitalistic. And it's usually seen, it does have this economic side, but it's also being seen as a way to overcome imperialistic sort of subjugation from the West. So it's a way to also achieve not only economic independence, but also like a sort of another kind of status. Together with the economic development, there was a huge demographic explosion of attraction, basically people from the countryside into the city. And as you see, compared to big capitals in developed economies, it was insane, basically. Between 1960 and 1990, the growth went from basically 2 million to 10 million in 30 years, which is a lot. And then another aspect or another part of this economic context is the idea of mass housing as a social contract within this developmental framework. Basically, developmentalism has three main actors, which is the authoritarian state, which sort of controls and gives power to the big construction companies to do a lot, but to do what they want. And then the emergence of a new urban middle class, who by being provided access to real estate property, they actually upgrade themselves to a new urban middle class. So the Patutanji become like these golden geese, where everybody who is within the system favors. So within the state of a government that can do mostly whatever they want, lack of housing because of a lot of people coming into the city attracted by industrial growth, and then the lack of housing. So basically it's this dual sense of relationships where the authoritarian state supports the middle class by providing housing, and by doing that it also controls that emergent middle class because you have the key to their success. The same thing, the authoritarian state encourages and controls and represses the big construction companies, and at the same time the construction companies get those big contracts, so they also support the state, and it's like a self-fulfilling cycle, which benefits everybody who is within the system. But then you have the urban poor, which get completely taken out from the system. The research period focuses 1962 so the coup d'etat was 1961, but 1962 is really when the 5-year economic plans get implemented, and together with them, together with all the planning laws get put in place to actually deal with the lack of housing, but also with the concentration of squatters in the city, and to actually open up ways for physical planning to support the economic growth. What is interesting to see here is the gap between the housing shortage and the housing provision did not start in the 60s. It was something that was coming back from 1920s actually, and then 1935, because 1935 was when the Japanese implemented a huge agricultural reform that kicked out a lot of the peasantry from the countryside, and they gave the land to the Japanese colonizers. So there was a big group of people that were kicked into the city, and the Japanese did not provide housing for them. So this imbalance, like this lack of housing, it's chronic for the whole century actually. And in 1960s, together with economic growth, a lot more people was attracted. So actually we have about 50% of the population in Seoul for a long period of time who did not have formal housing, and that's what became accumulated for a long period of time. By 2008, with the world financial crisis, I took that as a shifting point, because it really sort of made evident that a lot of the social context that favored the emergence of mass housing was shifting, and I take that as the bookend of my research. and you can start to see how like the curve really flattens out, and by 2010 is considered that in most of the country the lack of housing was 0%, and in Seoul it took until 2012 formally to be zero, the lack of housing. The economic shift I'm talking about refers to a bunch of different indicators, but one of them is the size of households in Korea, and it's basically the emergence of the one or two people household. So as you can see here, in 2015, 27% of the people were single households, and another 26% were two people households. So it's becoming like this atomization of society, which is something that happened already in Japan maybe 10 years ago, but now it's coming to Korea, and it's very quickly. So that brings a lot the emergency of the one room society, and it has changed a lot of living patterns, such as like there's a lot of restaurants where you could not be alone in one table, but now so there's a lot, like even menus have changed because they have to accommodate with this idea of people living alone. That the loss of population, not only like the prediction of population decrease in Seoul, but also the growth rate is also, I mean, it's been below zero for a long time, but it's not going to get better. And finally, the aging of society. So by right now it's about 15%, but it's calculated that by 2060 we'll reach 50% of the population will be super aged. So that's those are scary predictions, and they're coming very quick. So there's huge changes going on in society, where the model of the apartment as the house for the family with the children doesn't work anymore, and they're really not flexible enough to be adapted. So that model doesn't really work, and that's why I'm taking 2008 as the moment where all these social indicators came into place. So then I wanted to focus on okay, so what do I want to get out of this? Why am I looking at this? And for me, there were different reasons, but I realized that what I was interested in is in learning to look, basically. Like I realized that as architects, or me as an architect, I was very focused on formal aspects of architecture, and I had this mental block or filter which didn't allow me to actually look at apartments or things that I didn't consider architecture properly. So I tried to, and the fact of being foreigner in Seoul, because it prevented me from actually understanding many things, but actually gave me the freedom to actually look at them in a different way, free from maybe preconceptions or assumptions. So then I like this quote from John Habraken, which says, "Our subject then is not architecture, but the built environment, and it is innately familiar." So it's so familiar that we actually forget about it. So anew we observe what always has been with us, not to discover, much less to invent, but to recognize, and that's part of the argument of the everyday. And with that, there was also a methodological goal, which is to propose and test a methodology to describe, interpret, and criticize the built environment at different scales. Disciplinary goal, which would be to reclaim mass housing in Seoul as an architectural topic, to inquire about the spatial and organizational logics behind their assumed banality, and finally to evaluate the contribution of Korean mass housing to the evolution of modern mass housing as a discipline. And then strategically, I wanted to produce knowledge that could inform strategies for the maintenance, transformation, and adaptation of mass housing, catering to this shifting economic complex. So if things are changing, how can this thing that we have and it forms our, almost like our built nature, how can this nature, what do we do with it and how to do it? So, and what I was very focused though is to understand it from the disciplinary point of view. And I understand urbanism as the study of urban form and growth, focused on the relationship among urban elements or physical form, such as streets, building types, parcels, and infrastructures, urban processes or the mechanisms for intervention, construction, ownership, use, and transformation over time, and social practices or the collective processes of use, representation, experience, and imagination through time as the combination of three overlapping logics. So infrastructures, parcels, and buildings. So all these kind of big sort of difficult sort of environment. I wanted to reduce it from a disciplinary point of view to something I could work with and I could ask questions about. So it became reduced to these 3 scalar frameworks, which determine the 3 basic parts of the research. So it's basically from at the city scale, the infrastructure is city scale, parcels becomes the scale of the housing complex or the tangi, and then buildings the scale of like the buildings themselves and the scale of the unit. And then what I tried to do was to set myself some specific question a bit about each one of them, so I could actually take it as a way to drive the research, because otherwise it was too big. So at the city scale, I was wondering whether the implementation of mass housing at such a crazy scale was seen as a field of experimentation or an opportunity to define a long-term vision from a quantitative or qualitative point of view. Meaning, was there an idea of the city that was being built through all this housing, or they were just doing as they go? You know, so that's kind of an idea. At the scale of the complex, whether the evolution of Patu Tangi in Seoul has yielded original morphological contributions to the field of mass housing. So, is there something new that has contributed to something that was already going on in the world? And then, in terms of the buildings and the unit, how has the development of a standardized unit type shaped modern Korean domesticity? So basically, that became the 3 parts of my research, basically. And then, as starting points or hypothesis, I believed, or at the beginning I set up, okay, I will believe on this, which is Seoul's mass housing estates are the most characteristic spatial practice of modern urbanization in Korea. 2, models from the modern movement in architecture and urbanism have been adopted as technical and organizational technologies stripped from their social and ideological foundations. 3, Korean society does not perceive apartments as an architectural topic. And 4, the phenomenon of mass housing in Seoul is in transition due to the deep changes in the socio-economic model that supported it. And then I just wanted to have some images of what this has meant over the years. So 1969, I love this photograph. It's amazing. It's taken in Kumhwa-dong, which is north of Seoul, around like the hills around downtown, and it shows very clearly, three types of housing. In the front, we have systematized housing, the urban hanoks that were built since the 1920s by private developers as a new urban prototype of the hanoks by developers in kind of subdivided standardized lots as urban extension. Then we see in between them, we see some houses that are actually Japanese houses, you can see, and then some more modern houses, which are like what's been called the cultural housing, which is kind of that brick house with a flat roof there, which is more modern looking. Then we see the taltone on the hills, massive, and then in the middle ground is the introduction of the citizens' apartments as a strategy for the relocation of squatters, basically. So they would relocate them, destroy the taltone, and then build citizens' apartments. And at that time, that's late 60s. That was very similar to what had been going on in Hong Kong and Singapore, if you know, with very similar strategies by the public authority to relocate squatters. And so at that time, Korea was on like following on the jet stream of Singapore and Hong Kong, and there were all these conversations about how do you do social housing, well, not really social housing for the poor. These were very, very basic structures, and they were very based on German models from 1920s actually. So if you look at models from Frankfurt 1920, very similar, with actually very little adaptation to cultural standards of Korea. 1970s, mass housing as a territorial organization. If the first were experiments, and they failed because there were very bad construction methods. They were built very cheaply, and then there was this disaster of the Wawa Patu in 1969 actually. There were like the building collapsed. One of the buildings collapsed a few months after being built in the morning, and it killed quite a few people and injured many. And that was the end of the public housing policies of the government. The mayor Kim Hyun-ok he had to step out, and instead of fixing the policies, they just vanished. And that's a very important point in the development of mass housing, because from there, mass housing was not targeted anymore to the urban poor, but it was shifted to the middle class, and that's very different from what happened in Singapore or Hong Kong, and even Japan. So that in that sense, that's something very unique of Korea, the way it was targeted to the growing middle class. These were the apartments in Bampo, colonization of the shores of the river, and massive, really massive. So yeah, it really became a territorial organization. This was also linked to strategies for development of buildable land. The Han River was a dangerous place, and it needed to be controlled for flooding. So actually, by building the infrastructure of the river, they avoided the flooding, but they also gained a huge amount of buildable land, which was very cheap, right? Because they didn't have to buy it, and that became a huge source for the public authority. These are land and housing corporation buildings. 1960s. I love these two pictures. This is very famous picture by Chon Min-ju, Akujong Gangnam, and that's a photo from my hometown, Barcelona. The same time almost. The funny and almost the same character. So it's a huge, like these two people living very traditional lifestyles. Suddenly they have these objects landing on their front yard. Very similar building types, construction systems even. I mean, you can see the corridors. The balconies and the location of the windows are very similar types. The big difference though, besides the chimney, the big difference is, because probably those I don't think they have central heating. The big difference is this became one of the most expensive pieces of real estate in Korea. That's still public housing, and it's extremely cheap. So the same objects, the same physical layouts, but with very different social understandings, and to me that became very important. This is now at the center of Seoul. That's still in the peripheries, it had huge problems for many years, lack of facilities, lack of access. They didn't have the problems of Paris in terms of the periphery of the social problems. I don't know why, but for a long time they were marginalized. They were located just because the land was cheap. 1980s. There's another kind of turning point with the development of. Well, I'll explain that later. But development of new typologies, and I see this as a watershed moment also of development of the typology in Korea, because it's really when it stops from, it does not copy from outside anymore, but it starts developing their own models, and for me those are very interesting. So these are the Olympic apartments built for the 1988 games, still under the public authority, but capitalizing on the idea of opening up South Korea as a kind of coming of age of a modernized and rich country in the kind of society of developed countries. So it was like it was housing for the athletes, but it was also housing for the journalists, and it was also built up as a background for the events, same as a lot of the projects on the Han River. And then the idea of tabula rasa and apartments or mass housing as a strategy for urban renewal in traditional fabrics, with nothing which get completely erased, and there's absolutely zero maintenance of urban fabrics, communities, or even street layouts or parcels. It's a completely new idea. So that was the introduction basically. In terms of looking at the city scale, as you know, like the idea was to understand what was how was this idea of, okay, let's build the city anew, was that understood as something that was happening, or there was just like putting out fires, right? And the way I approached this was through understanding, like trying to set up an idea of phasing, understanding, mapping the location of the apartments to see what were the logics of location, and then understanding how the different plans that had been drawn up for the city, how did they incorporate mass housing in those plans. So one would be more like the ideological, okay, how did people think of mass housing in the plans, but then how it actually became implemented. In terms of phasing, I divided the period of study from 1962 to 2008 in 4 large phases, which I called first phase of provision of minimums, second one and then some experiments with mass housing, generalization of mass housing, and then a transition to the private sector right after those the watershed of the Olympic apartments, and then after 1990 population decline in municipal Seoul because people moved to the satellite cities, and then after 97, after the crisis, an economic deregulation. That so the different years of 1972, 86, and 97 correspond mostly to economic moments or policy or construction of mass housing. For example, in 1962, there's all these laws that were implemented to kind of jumpstart the kind of the construction of a physical infrastructure that would allow for economic recovery. 1972 as the end of the second cycle of economic cycle, where there's a new Seoul master plan, and then they start to, based on the experiments from the first 10 years, they start to develop laws that actually call for, that they're driven only for the production of mass housing, and especially the housing promotion law and the provisional law for the development of special housing districts of 1972 really spearheaded the construction of mass housing. In 86, there was this big project of the construction of 5 million housing units of mass housing all over Korea that ended at that point, and that's also the beginning of the democratic kind of transition, basically. And then 97, the crisis really hit the developmental model. It's the end of the 5-year cycles, intervention of IMF, and then liberalization of the price of apartments, and then a new type of morphology of new types of apartments come up, Tower Palace, for example, so which are very different, and they're catered to very different types of people. And then finally, the 2008 economic crisis also shift like as an indicator of changes. So what I did here was to take each one of the phases and through GIS map out the construction of apartment complexes where they would be, and then to try to identify logics in relationship to the urban infrastructure that was built at that time and with topography. So for the first phase, what we encounter, very few apartments, and the ones that we find are the citizens' apartments built on the hillsides around the downtown to relocate squatters. But then we start to see a line of growth towards the river, along basically the train lines, and then a little bit of colonization of spots along the river as part of the huge project of actually construction of the river. For me, the Han River is really a construct, because before it used to be a lot more meandering and much more like it would flood a much bigger area, and in order to gain to make it safer, but also to gain buildable land, Yoido was built as an island, and then we have the Icheondong, which became test beds also, not only for apartments but also for new urban grids that would start to colonize, and that would be the precedent then for Gangnam and for Jamsil. The second phase, 1970s and 80s, we start to see the explosion of those logics I was telling you about. In blue are the areas of the river where the waterfront became reconstructed. You see how I like how Jamsil didn't even exist, and then so actually the lake of Jamsil is actually that second branch of the river that was down there, and that's still like a dangerous area to build. That's why the Lotte Tower had so many issues with foundations, because it's actually on a sandy bed. And then colonization of the river front eastwards. We see, for example, beyond the river, we start to see the construction of new towns, of Mokdong, for example, and then we also start to see things happening in the north, and then scattered growth of already urban reconstruction in the center. And then there's the appearance of there there are kind of there's a diffuse logic also, which depends on the beginning of the joint redevelopment projects, through which the city would allow private owners together with construction companies to actually propose development of their own old housing, and then those would not be part of any larger plan. 1980s, 90s, more towards the privatization of the sector, we start to see all the growth of Noandong, the completion of Mokdong, and then Gayang and Sanghua to the west, and then a lot of infill, and then the scattered logic of the joint redevelopment projects. Interestingly enough, since the 90s, like the spread is really large. It shows how after 97 the privatization. So at this point, Land and Housing Corporation has very little impact, and it's mostly private development. So they target a lot of older, either older apartments, because it's been already 20 years of the first ones or 30 years. So that's when by law you could renew them, but also the buildable land has been fulfilled, and now it's more like urban regeneration. And then you start to see also regeneration of older apartments, like the ones in Jamshil, which get renewed. So it's more scattered logics. At the beginning, we saw how things follow certain plans, certain logics, but then more and more with privatization, those logics become very diffuse. And then a second part would be looking at the role of mass housing in the different plans for the city. We see, for example, the new Seoul plan, which is something I really love, this iconic design, which was never meant to be built, but in that the role of mass housing was really a symbolic figure, where the not the middle class, but actually the ruling class would live in mass housing. In the Seoul city plan of 1966, they wouldn't even think about mass housing yet. In the Han River Development Plan, which was designed by Kim Soo-gun's office, it was basically like mass housing, which are all these little white buildings were meant to be mass housing. He was very based or he was very influenced by the Tokyo plan by Kenzo Tange. And then mass housing was also kind of a symbolic, because it was not figured out how it would actually operate. The plan for Gangnam did not include mass housing from the beginning, so it was something that was added much later, surprisingly. The Citizens Apartment Project, I love this photo because these are the Naksan apartments in what is that area? What the Changchingdong. So this Changchingdong, these apartments used to be there. And then the Uido plan as part of the Han River project. So the mass housing in almost every plan, as the time goes, mass housing has a different role. Sometimes it's housing for the poor people. Sometimes it's some symbolic new plans for the new city. In this Jamshil New Town, actually, it included originally a lot of low rise, and then mass housing was only for certain areas, and then it changed over time. The Yeongdong district plan for Gangnam did not include housing originally, mass housing. Mokdong New Town, and then we start to see from the joint development projects, JR, mass housing starts to become like the default at that point. And that was due, there's a very interesting point, during the 70s, the rule of Park Chung-hee was very contested. There was a lot of problems internationally, but also inside Korea, domestically. So politically, it was a difficult time. There was a lot of conflict with North Korea, and because of that, and because of the proximity with the boundary, he personally did not want Seoul to have a lot of people, and he started to have strategies for the distribution of people throughout the metropolitan area. That went completely. So because as you know, Seoul has a dual planning scheme. It depends on national, or at that time it depended on national planning, but at the same time it had the local planning, and the two of them really collided because the local administrators really wanted to provide the housing because it was needed, but then the big guy did not want that to happen. So actually there was this conflict of there was some projects to adopt mass housing, but it was not possible to implement that because the national plan would actually be turning down all the So, for example, the Seoul City master plans were basically turned down a lot of times because they included mass housing, and the central government did not want that. At the moment where his assassination in 1979, after that, all his kind of ideas of redistribution of the population sort of go away, and that's when mass housing is finally really embraced as the only way to deal with the demographic boom. We have the 5 satellite cities outside the green belt, which became very important because it's the only moment when actually you see the population of Seoul starting to decrease. And then these are the, I think this was terrible. Actually, the New Town Initiative, which was basically reconstructing and it's been implemented, some of them. I don't know if you have seen the one in, what do you call it, the one very close to downtown. I can't remember the name now. This one. But basically it meant the destruction, literal destruction of many neighborhoods, and the idea, or the original idea, it had a social meaning because it tried to provide, it's mostly implemented on the Gambuk, because it tried to provide amenities that the poor neighborhoods did not have in comparison to Gangnam, so it was a kind of a way to balance opportunity, but then it did not include any strategy to actually retain the communities. So then it tried to fight gentrification and actually favored it. And then with the new mayor, since 2010, no, he came into power in 2009. Then all of this was rolled back, and the new plan of Seoul since 2006 was changed. Okay, 2006. So in a way, these are different projects that incorporated mass housing. They were done, but in all of them, mass housing had a different meaning. So as a conclusion, in a way, the adoption of mass housing in Seoul did not follow a long-term vision for the city that was being built. The decisions about the location of the housing estates, their size, and the systems of aggregation were only partially integrated with the existing city, with the natural features and other structures of growth. The roles within the city also shifted over time. Sometimes there were symbols of modernization, sometimes there were social housing for the relocation of squatters, sometimes there were strategies for the colonization of new land along the river, or colonization of virgin land through the new towns. They were built sometimes to build urban facades along the river or along the main highway to Busan, or there were strategies for inner city renewal and expansion to the metropolitan area through the satellite cities. This lack of kind of vision was due to the magnitude of the housing shortage, the lack of buildable land, the conflicting policies between the local and national authorities, and actually short-sighted economic profit since the turn towards the private sector. This problem-solving attitude and the late adoption of mass housing discouraged late adoption compared to many other countries, which actually after the war they had to reconstruct, right? So we have in Korea we started mass housing was started in the 60s. So there was this 20 years since the end of the World War, where in many other countries this was actually been implemented, and there was a huge availability of solutions that had been already tried and tested. So that discouraged theoretical experimentation and instead favored the perpetuation of tried and tested solutions borrowed from abroad. And then over time, those solutions became assembled into a set of practices that were validated from experience, not from theory, and were consolidated into an organizational technology which standardized the construction of mass housing estates as independent urban fragments. Okay, sorry, that's what I was talking about. Yeah. So then, and then there's a point where, okay, and then I started to find that there were some kind of repetitive patterns of what these sort of models borrowed from the modern movement. Basically, I started to see that in different projects, those sort of schemes or those schemas were repetitive. One of them is tabula rasa, and it's a word that in Seoul I always hear about planning. It's always the idea of tabula rasa. It's a new beginning, free from any pre-existences. The idea of making artificial ground, and that's a topic that, for example, the construction of the river waterfront as a new land where you can actually build apartments, but also it's in Seonsanga, for example. It's in many developments that cover over in the Cheonggyecheon, for example. There's always this idea, and that comes from the Japanese metabolism. And if you think about it, Kim Soo-gun actually was in Tokyo at the time of the development of metabolism. So there's a lot of ideas of metabolism that came. And the idea of artificial ground, it makes a lot of sense because of the lack of land, but also the difficult topography and also the floods in Changma. So this idea of building a new base on top of which you can do things became very useful. Optimization of land acquisition. Probably, as you know, one of the main tools for planning in Korea since the Japanese occupation was the land readjustment projects, because it was cheap. Like the government didn't have to pay anything, and then it actually allowed you to gain urban land and infrastructure for free. So that became, I think, 60% of Seoul was developed through land readjustment projects. The problem with that is that when you wanted to implement really large projects, it hindered actually development, because one, people would sit on their properties rather than actually contribute, because they were expecting the price to go up. Because it limits the margins that you can take for the public entity. It actually limits the construction of big infrastructures, parks, and larger organizations that would not depend only on single parcels. But if you wanted to organize like a satellite city, for example, or a new town, it was not good. So then, since 1983, in Mokdong New Town, a new type of assembly of land was implemented, where the government would be allowed to buy or to acquire a huge piece of land and then lot it out, but then have a big planning that would prevail. And that's how Mokdong was done. That's why you can have that central spine, because it like with a normal land readjustment project, you would never be able to get that. The idea of street grids as frameworks for urban development, it's kind of a very colonial idea. And I'm from Spain, so like that's how South America was all, like it comes from the Romans. The idea of the streets is not only a way of communicating, but it's also a way to frame and to decide the size of development. So it's very connected to real estate property, and then the distribution of networks and infrastructures. Within that, the idea of urban blocks as units of that development. No? Once you have lotted out parts, then you can sell them to developer, and then individual developers can build. The neighborhood unit. It's an idea also in Korea. I never heard so much people who are not architects talking about the neighborhood unit. It's kind of a narrative that always comes up, but actually people don't know what it means. So it's actually it's a name, but the social meaning of it has been lost. And it just means that it's a kind of an urban fragment, self-contained with its own amenities. But it's never dealt with the actual social component of through which Perry came up with the idea, which was fighting the alienation of people in the big metropolises. So he wanted to create self-contained communities within 500 or 400 meter radius around the school, because that would be the distance of someone being able to walk without being killed by a car. And then the idea of linear structures of growth, it's something that at a certain point in the 60s, because that's when the plan for Hook New Town in England was implemented. And the idea of linear infrastructure of growth had a strong impact also in the metabolists in Japan. And then it was adopted in the plan for Mokdong, but there were precedents from before that allowed for it. And it was very useful, because instead of thinking of radial central systems of organization, the linear plan it allows for growth over time, and there's more people that can depend on that. And it also matches the idea of it matches infrastructures for transportation. And then the idea of new town, it's an idea that I think at least it has 3 different implications. The original idea comes from the idea of creating a new socio-political actually model in England, where there was actually a criticism of capitalism, and they wanted to get people out of the city and create these networks of cities in the countryside where the citizens would be actually owners of a cooperative, so they would work on the land and they would benefit from it. But new town in Korea has been used to talk about Jamsil new town, meaning extension of the city extension, the satellite cities outside the city, but then also in the end it has come to mean urban renewal inside the city. So there's nothing to do with the original meaning of the new town in itself. So for me these 9, sorry, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. These 8 sort of paradigms of modern planning and architectural processes, strategies, and formal models have become tools. So basically, there was no large vision of the city that was being used or built, but instead there was a development of tools that could be implemented whenever, depending on the size or of the development. These tools became really useful as paradigms to work with. And then I think Mokdong is a paradigm where that's the plan for Hook New Town. It was based on, instead of having radial growth, it was based on this central spine of services with pedestrian linkages that would connect to your neighborhood units, and then with a ring road of vehicular traffic from the backside. And this model has, I mean, it was never built, but the model was very influential. And I think the planning, the book that they came out from that, has been one of the most influential planning books ever bought. The linear structure in Mokdong, which is actually then being copied and repeated a lot in the satellite cities. In like, if you think of Pundang, it's exactly the repetition like that at a much larger scale. And then if you look at the other ones, it's a model that became very successful. And then so then from the paradigms that were implemented in Mokdong, we find first tabula rasa. Mokdong used to be an agricultural community, and there were a lot of squatters. The main reason for Mokdong to be developed was because it was very close to the old airport, and they assumed that they were already when they were planning the Olympics, they knew that when people would, like the foreigners, would be flying in, and they would see the squatter settlement. So one of the ideas was, okay, let's eradicate all of that. Let's reconstruct the edge of the river so we could actually gain buildable land. So land, tabula rasa, the land reclamation along the building a new land, housing site development to acquire the whole site, and then have an overall arching scheme that then different parts would fit in. The idea of neighborhood units, and then in here they even went farther. Neighborhood units were organized also not only as a singular neighborhood unit, but they had different scales, so belonging to different services in each scale, and then a linear development along a central spine, which could virtually actually extend on both ends and kind of continue. So it's been a model that then after that it became successfully implemented in many other places. I'm skipping. I'm sorry because I know it's very late, so I'm kind of skipping things. The scale of the housing complex. The main idea was to understand whether the evolution of Patutang in Seoul yielded original morphological contributions, and to do that, what I did was I selected cases. This was done through comparison of case studies. So the idea was, okay, which case studies do you select, and what do you compare among them? Put them in a timeline and compare what it gives. What I came up with, there were 2 ideas when in the choice of case studies. One was that they had to sort of evenly provide examples throughout the whole timeline. So they had to cover the whole span of the research. And second, each one of them had to be each one of them had to be or provide an innovation that would then be relevant from then on. So there are 12 of them. There were more, but then they were dropped on the way. And so these are the case studies, and then the other question is, okay, so what do you, well, so you know them. Mapo Apartments, Hangang Apartments, Yoido Shibum, Bampo, Jamshil Itanji, Akujong, Jamshil Otanji, Asian Athletics, Olympic, Mapo Samsung, which is actually the renovation of the first Mapo, as an idea of urban renewal, Samsung Tower Palace, and then the Jamshil Itanji renovation, also to show the renovation of apartments themselves. And then in terms of the topics I would be looking at, one was the planning background, or within which type of larger urban plan it was part of, and what were the natural resources. And here you see the line filling of the river in order to create Akujong. What was their internal organization? How were buildings grouped together? Usage of open space. How was open space understood or defined and defined? Circulation networks, commercial facilities, residential building types, boundaries, and then the sort of statistics of land use. And these 12 topics then became, each one of them became a timeline, which I'm gonna skip for you guys. But basically, for me, the main conclusions was that there are 3 distinct periods in the evolution of the design of Apatu Tanji in Seoul. An initial phase was characterized by the adoption of Zeilenbau site planning. I don't know if I pronounced correctly, but you look at designs for Frankfurt and Germany in the 20s and 30s, and they were exactly like that. Also with the same the chimney and the same amount of floors, exactly all the same, because there was not even an elevator. So it's basically a configuration based on parallel rows of residential buildings developed in Germany during the second half of the 20s. By the end of the 70s, after 20 years of using them, they became exhausted because they couldn't cope for the necessary residential density. The space in between the blocks, because the height became too tall, the space between the blocks became too large and unused, so there was too much waste. The residential space became very monotonous due to the large size of the slides. We have in Akujong, no, in Jamshil Otanji, the slabs are 110 meters long, and they're like 15-story high. So you can imagine, that's that diagram of the height according to the space in between, and the distances are so big that it's really like the density doesn't increase anymore. It kind of starts to go down. But there's also there's an increase in people's buying power, which translates into a larger car ownership, and there was not enough car parking anymore. So people started to occupy playgrounds. They started to occupy the green areas, and it was obvious that the diagram didn't cope anymore. There was the different strategies for planning they were not coordinated. So you had buildings on one side, but you had circulations on the other side. There was not really differentiation of pedestrian paths versus vehicular paths, and more than that, there was a change of people's lifestyles, basically, also having to do with modernization and with increase of economic power. And one of the main things that changed was the demand for leisure spaces, so all of these consolidated in the 80s due to 2 main occasions. One was the occasion of the 2 international events of the 1986 Asian Athletic Games and the Summer Olympics of '88. And then the discussion, finally, all the discussion about and the criticism of functionalist planning in the 60s in Europe and in the US finally came to Korea. And it's so a new way of planning Tanji developed around the idea of clusters. And the characteristics were this articulation of different scales within the complex. So it's not just a repetition of the same module over and over, but there was the creation of smaller entities or neighborhoods within the complex, so an idea of scales, hierarchical spatial structure, the idea of composing facades as a whole, not just as a repetition of the same, but there was an idea of a whole. They started to have references to Korean traditional residential features and environments. For example, architect Cho, which he designed the Asian Athletics, and he still lives there. I don't know, but if you knew, but for example, the parking lots are located in the center of the courtyards, but they're not accessible through the cores. So you have to exit the elevator on the first floor, go out, and then walk to the parking, and then the parking has an underground. And he did that in purpose to facilitate random encounters within the neighbors. So it's actually, and he himself has explained this, he calls it a plan, like planning people's random encounters. So that would be possible. That's also when the idea of the NLDK, the Korean kind of the typical layout that we have, or that everybody kind of is familiar with. One of the ways in which he thought about it, about creating a large living space, was so you could have funerals, where people were still having funerals at home. So then, in order to fit the box, you could have it in the living room. The elevators were big enough so you could actually have the box laying horizontally, not vertically, because that was a big problem, that people were having the boxes vertically, and then the body would kind of squat down. Also, you could have weddings at home. People at that time, there was no wedding hall, so people were holding the weddings at home. And then there's this idea that I think in traditional Korean weddings, people used to bring the bride would come with a big box full of all the goodies. So then to carry the box in the corridors were wide enough, so actually you could have that in the apartment. There's also the idea of the, if you think about it, the sloping profile. It serves like lighting purposes, natural light to all the units, but also I mean, if you think about it, it's a loss of FAR, and it's hard to build. No developer would want to do this now. But it was done to recreate the hillsides of around downtown Seoul. So there's all these kind of, it's like really, for me, a watershed of the design. There was a diversity of circulations and open spaces and the incorporation of previous natural features, the hierarchy of circulations. There was no, so all of these kind of requirements did not boil down to fixed spatial formulas. So actually you can see these compared to, we'll see later, the Olympic apartments, and they follow many of the same guidelines, but the forms are completely different. So it was not like a reduction of formal options, but it was more like a organizational. And then all of the elements of planning were sort of cohesive. So building, circulations, landscape, and parking, and even the location of the civic center and the commercial spaces were integrated into one cohesive design. That came together also with the idea of authorship. And here there was the public housing authorities would provide this. It was done by not by architects, but by more like financiers and bureaucrats. In here, both the Asian Athletics and the Olympics were designed through design competitions, and there was one architect who signed and was responsible for the project, and that really also made a difference. At the end of the 80s, though, three factors interrupted the development of site planning based on clusters. One was a new type of urban renewal policy, the joint redevelopment processes, which, as I explained, basically means that private owners and private construction companies, together with approval of the government, were allowed to create their own redevelopment projects. So it was driven by private profit, shift to private development, and then the need to increase residential density to address the housing shortage, but also to increase economic profit. But together with all of that, there was no specific design solutions developed to cope with this increase of density. Private developers simply borrowed the spatial formulas developed during the previous decade, stripped them from their community building aspirations, and maximized them to cater to the housing and financial demand. And that's what we see at the end, where if you overlook it, it kind of looks like it's clusters, but then the way it works is not really like clusters. So basically they just took some of the shapes developed until then, and then they just kind of went with them. So if you look at in this case, for example, small things is all the cores from here. You access your core from the cluster where you are from. In those, some of the buildings enter from one side and some others from the other side. So it doesn't really correspond to a social idea. It's more like organizational, basically. So cluster layouts lost their social agenda, but were adopted as practical, technical, formal, and organizational solutions because since the planned provision of common facilities, open space, and parking did contribute to a better residential environment. I mean, that was still better than this, right? And then with the liberalization of prices after the 1997 crisis, new morphologies and building types were developed, such as the Samsung Tower as a paradigm of that shift. So basically, they adopted more like the global housing prototypes that are kind of found all over anywhere in the world. And then, yeah, that's basically what I explained. In here, there were the timelines of the different topics. I'm just gonna go through them. But basically, what I did was, diagramming them in order to come up with the conclusions I came up with. The idea of clusters, use of open space, the way open space becomes more complex in the variety, but also in the way it is defined as parts of sequences. At the beginning, there were no sequences, there was no thinking. Open space was basically spaces that were carved out from the mass of housing, and then whereas towards the end, open space becomes like the buildings actually shape open space, and there's a clear idea of sequences of open space, especially in the two watershed moments of the Asian apartments and the Olympic apartments. The circulations, the commercial facilities I find interesting because there's an evolution from the Mapo apartments in 1962. They used the basement for shopping in order to cater and provide for the community. When they started to build along the Han River, it was far from the city, so they had to provide more commercial facilities, but they were still using the first floors of the buildings, the first, and then little by little you see the development of the Sangha typology as a freestanding building, more like a core and shell building where you provide services and access, and then it's basically a free plan that people just rent out and lotify, and then you build that building. Again, the Asian Athletics and the Olympic, the Sangha is not a Sangha anymore, but it's understood as a civic center, which is the center of the athletic games and the Olympics. So it works as a background, institutional background, and it's something that you would see when when they were showing it on TV. And then finally, after the 90s, the Sangha becomes like the most efficient way of enveloping space in the cheapest way possible. Same thing with the residential building types. At the beginning, there was experiments with this was an interesting type. It's highly inefficient, but they thought it was very efficient because it had only one stair. But in reality, when you start when you try to compose these in a parcel, the different arms create a lot of empty spaces in plan. But this came from the planning of in San Luis. There's a very famous project. You know sorry. Prodaigo, when it was built, it won many awards. So then people say, "Oh, this has won many awards. Let's put it here," and then it's very inefficient actually.
But Prodaigo has the second typology.
Both actually has both. There was a whole part.
Oh yeah, there's one.
Yeah. So somehow, like
they're all gone anyway. So
was that what?
They're all gone.
They're all gone. But you still see some, like in near Akujong, they still want, or maybe they're gone now. In Ichongon, like, right? They're not too tall, but they're still. But if you look at the landscape, it's very inefficient because it creates a lot of corners. Then
there's one in Pyongyang as well.
Really? So see that it became like this kind of global typology that people started to copy. It was highly inefficient, so then in the second phase they had to build blocks on the perimeter of Mapo because there was not enough people. As you know, the corridor type became very common, and it kind of reproduced some of the ideas of the Colmo Gil, and people had a community, and then finally we just have the core, which allows for a lot more flexibility in the organization of the slabs. The idea of boundary, the Tanji has embedded in it the idea of boundary, and at the beginning there were just very little fences. I love the idea of how actually Mapo Apartments was built on a Japanese colonial prison. So the idea of like this idea of creating something modern and as a showcase for modernity, but actually the wall was the wall of the prison, and people were very isolated from the community in Mapo. And then how over time with the sophistication of landscape features, the boundary became more embedded into this thicker layering of landscape features. And then what we see from the data from basically the land use stats was there's of course an crazy increase of areas for parking, to the point that I think it was this one, the Hangang mentioned apartments almost have 50% of areas dedicated to either roads or parking, which was kind of crazy. And then at one point, also in the Asian Athletics Village apartments, it was too much. It was really crazy. And then that's when they start to build up underground, of course. And that's where we are now, where actually the whole site is thought of as a one building, where you kind of carve up the whole site, build 2 or 3 stories of parking underneath, and then the towers in the parking, on top of it. And finally, the scale of the housing unit. In here, I was interested in the idea of how the high standardization of the unit type has shaped Korean the way people live in family. And what I did with this one is a little bit different from the previous ones, because what I did was to understand the idea of home as a dialectic tension in between the standardization of domestic space versus the appropriation of domestic space by the users. So there's always this conflict between who, like home as a tool for change towards the formation of a new modern society by the government, like let's provide these people with a way to live that is modern. So it's a way to civilize people, to urbanize people, and to modernize people, or versus home as a guarantor of cultural traditions and protection of private life and family life. Or the idea of homes as repetitive units, part of a community planning, versus homes as self-sufficient individualized habitats, community life versus family privacy, government control versus individual freedom of choice. Who decides how the home should be? The people who will plan and build it, the experts, or who decides the home should be the people who live in them, residents? And then embedded in here is also the idea of how the models of architecture are played out. So the globalizing aspiration of modern architecture as a solution that would be importable or exportable and would work, or the local implementations that it has when it lands in the different locations. So in terms of the standardization of domestic space, what I found was that the development of the apartment unit transformed everyday life by introducing modern technologies of living, of course. One of the main ideas of all the scientific studies in housing was to actually overcome disease and social traumas of children living with their parents and people eating where they were sleeping and all of these things that have a long history. The modernization of domestic environments through the unit layout was not a mere process of passive importation and assimilation of modern lifestyles from abroad, as I honestly had originally thought, but it featured a high level of hybridization through the preservation and adaptation of traditional lifestyles, and I find that hybridization super interesting. Nevertheless, the domestic environment became highly standardized. The focus on efficiency and optimization resulted in simplified formal layouts, devoid of social connotations and normalizing households and gender roles. The shift towards private development since the end of the 70s, together with the housing shortage, prevented further development and experimentation. And if you compare, for example, with what happened in Japan with the Japan Housing Corporation in Singapore or in Hong Kong, because the public entities were the ones actually driving development, and they had the capability to organize connections with academia and actually to do research. Surprisingly enough, well, no, it's not surprising. The public in those countries, there's a huge innovation in housing and habitats, and actually they're very innovative. In Korea, never, since the 70s, we use the same type of layouts as from the 70s with better finishes, but so it's kind of, I find it very poor actually. It's a pity. In terms of the appropriation of domestic space by the users, even in a Patutangi, open space is a valuable asset treated as commons. Temporal occupations, informal extensions, and appropriations benefit individual interests and are negotiated with the community in a collective agreement. So even though Tangi have very strict regulations and there's all the security guards, there are unwritten rules of in play which are very interesting to observe and to follow. In spite of the intended secludedness of Patutangi, they establish symbiotic relationships with their surroundings, with which they share open space and amenities in return for services. The NLDK unit type is highly standardized and does not lend itself easily to adaptations by residents. But once an alteration becomes viral, it is incorporated into the formal design. For example, the heated floors. Originally, apartments did not have heating floors. The covering of the outdoor balconies, which we take for granted, were also actually almost like self-made adaptations. So there's all these adaptations that actually have become formalized. And then the degree, scale, and impact of the residents' adaptations is directly related to the economic value of the Tangi and its social status. People in Tower Palace, they don't modify the appearance of their apartment because it's status, whereas people from poor neighborhoods, they do it because it's their convenience. And all of these are kind of sub-themes that you could develop in themselves. But one thing that I find very interesting is how the standardization of domestic space did shape modern family. That's a very interesting graph. To me, it was not known before I looked into this. This is the growth rate of Korea, of Korean War, like huge decrease of population. But then after 55, there's a huge, it bounces back. And in 1960, it stops very quickly and it starts to go down again. 1960, the Korean government started to implement policies for limiting the amount of children people were having, very similar to the ones in China, but nobody talks about this. And this was done because they were very afraid that having too many children would hinder economic growth. And that's why now there's no children really. So it's that what's happening now is not a random result of things. It's because people look at those are posters by the Parenthood Federation of Korea, where they were saying, okay, if you have too many, you'll be poor. There were programs of forced sterilization of poor women, where they were taking them, they were sterilizing them and giving them money. They were punishing people. If you had too many people, you would not be. You could not take them to school. You could not have medical attention. So they were quite brutal, actually. And I mean, it really shows. Like you could not participate in lists for public housing if you had more than 2 at certain times. So it was quite brutal, and it's not not very well known. So yeah. What it says is like one family full of love, one child full of health, meaning if you have more than one children, you will not be able to feed them, right? Looking at precedents for the standardization, of course, the Hanok, and how the central space, the Marang, has been related to the central living room, but also presence of the existence minimum and the minimization. Actually, if you look at many of these layouts, you compare to the initial layouts of Mapo apartments and the citizens' apartments, they're very similar. A not so well known evolution was the spec housing in the 60s and 70s when mass housing was still not adopted. Private developers, smart enough, they were catering to the needs of population. And they were building spec houses, meaning it was for sale housing, and I mean that you still see them, and they're very nice actually. And they were built according to they were so-called cultural housing because they took shapes of, some of them look like French houses, some of them look like German houses, and there was this, even though they don't, right? But and there were different typologies of the roofs. And so on. But then if you look at the plan, it's very similar to the Hanok actually. So that's very interesting. There's always this idea that you enter through a covered courtyard which is it's not really a living room. It's more like it's like it's a vestibule really, which distributes, and then the distribution of the ansarang and all, like the internal distribution is very similar, except that it incorporates, for the first time, it incorporates the kitchen and the bathrooms inside, and that becomes a huge step in the evolution. The woman's quarters becomes the master bedroom, but still kind of the same meaning. And then a very, very important one was the development of the NLDK apartment system. So we call NLDK in Korea, but that comes from something that was very studied in the 50s in Japan. There was a group of academics developing the perfect modern house for the new Japanese family after the war. And they were very based on Japanese became very kind of ashamed of how Westerners would see them when well, something that I know for me as an architect, I was always amazed about the flexibility of Asian kind of distributions. But for the Japanese, the fact that you were almost sleeping and eating and sleeping in the same place, it became kind of something shameful. And so then they wanted to modernize traditional lifestyles from a highly reformist and hygienist point of view. So they wanted to have a separate kitchen where you would eat. They would separate the quarters from children and parents. Spaces became specialized. And then the dining kitchen becomes the center of family life because there's no corridor, basically. But because the kitchen is fixed, it forces people to start having tables and chairs. So it's like this westernization of furniture. And then westernization of hygiene and cooking habitats. So this is part of this hybridization. And then comparing the plants, in green is the Korean NLDK. So at the beginning, the plans were very based on existence minimum layouts with corridors. And I find it interesting, actually, the development of an NLDK system in Korea is actually the death of the corridor. So the corridor, which was like an evolution that in Europe it took a long time to develop the corridor as a paradigm of privacy and how you would have, the servants not interfering with the owners. So the corridor becomes like this magnific tool. Actually, in Korea, the corridor is killed, and then there were some points where you have like hybrids where there's NLDK but there's still corridor, and over time the corridor gets killed, which it really implies. I mean, I'm saying killed in a sarcastic way, but I actually find it very interesting because it's not just a blind acceptation of models from abroad, but it actually, because in the West, for example, this boundary between the public areas of the house and the private areas, like the day and night, for us is very clear, and we kind of take it for granted. In Korea, that disappears the moment you start to have rooms on the other side, and that's very common, right? So it really describes a different understanding of privacy, actually. And I find that very interesting because we kind of take it for granted, but when you start looking at the evolution of things, it does have a long history. So that's that. And then some traits of the NLDK is the... You're very familiar with it.
Photographed by author. Is it your...
No, well, some are friends, some are...
It's okay.
In here, I was looking at how people actually. So the same way that there's a user's appropriation of spaces, there's also appropriation of spaces in the Tanji and of pushing the boundaries of rules in order to benefit their everyday life, basically. So I found a lot of adaptations. I found a very interesting study of the original Mapo apartments before they destroyed them to renew them. There was a Korean scholar, who actually went into every single room or every single unit and drew all the adaptations. And it's very interesting. It's very similar to one that was done for the what's the name of Le Corbusier Le Fruge development. Le Corbusier did a housing project. I can pronounce the French name. Fruge. It's like the one with a vault, and they also were highly modified. So this is actually the scholar who did this was actually based on those developments, and he was mapping all the transformations people did over time. I like, for example, how people actually used to have markets. Now they don't have so much anymore, but basically because the Tangi itself did not provide enough commercial activities, there were itinerant markets that would move around in different Tangi. Extensions of commercial spaces into public corridors to have terraces outside, plantings, parking is a huge problem. How in the Olympic apartments there's this very beautiful candy-shaped commercial space, but inside it became Taltovnitside by all the vendors that kind of really colonized and built stuff. The use of the security guys as all kind of jack of all trades, where like the security guy is also takes care of your pets, it takes care of your plants, it's supposed to take care of the house when you're not there, and you can beat them around. And then the idea of the highly sophistication of Korean delivery coming from the lack of services inside the apartments, actually. Because when in the Hangang apartments, which were the first ones that were actually built outside the city, the people started to realize that in order to get clients, you had to move to them. So it's like if Mahoma doesn't come to the mountain would move to Mahoma, and those were for free actually. So that's why a lot of the delivery is still free, because of that idea. And then the same way that you move goods into the Tangi, you also move people out. So then you have the delivery of students, and you have like to go to church, and so there's all this kind of system of mobilities that overcome the limitations of the system. And then what I did is I did a series of interviews with different families in different types of ownership, different types of apartment, different sizes, different economic systems. And what I did is I interviewed them, and then what I did is I interviewed them based on how did they adapt into this framework that was given to them, and what were how did they push the boundary in order to make it fit into their everyday life. And what I did is I drew the interviews, basically. This was like a mapping of the different, so there were more, but in here three samples, and different ages, different types of ownership, areas, floors, and so on. So just to provide a variety of different cases. And then this one is in the new Mapo apartments, and then different ideas. And I drew it as a cartoon, so it would be more funny or more interesting. This one was funny because they had a grandmother living with them, so the grandmother was the one still living or sleeping in a more traditional way, but all of the other ones became very westernized. Okay, I'm going to read this and I'm going to finish. So mass housing estates in Seoul have become a special organizational protocols which standardize the built environment at different scales. They are both an engine and an outcome of the period of economic growth. The construction of mass housing did not follow a unified urban vision. The main features have been a focus on techniques rather than theory, detachment of spatial references from their social background, standardization of planning through geographic spatial formulas, and fragmentation and privatization of the city into housing enclaves. At the scale of the housing complex, the most relevant contribution to the international diffusion of mass housing was the development of a cohesive site planning strategies based on clusters. And then they were lost with the shift to the private sector at the end of the 80s. Those models were stripped from their social and theoretical agendas and pressed into service as efficient spatial and organizational solutions. The development of a standardized unit layout under the stewardship of the developmental administration hybridized modern foreign models with traditional lifestyles, especially in terms of the use of corridors for privacy, furniture, and posture. And the hegemony of private development prevented the further evolution of the unit layout, favoring instead uniformity and neutrality. And then where do we go from here? So I believe Seoul mass housing estates have accomplished their mission to provide housing the most efficient way within a context of demographic boom, lack of buildable land, and shortage of public funding. The global financial crisis of 2008 made evident that the economic growth was slowing down. The housing shortage had finally been overcome, and household composition and population trends are changing radically. These symptoms point to a new stage in the modernization process and to a shift of urban paradigm. And that's kind of what I believe. So the research findings lay the foundation for this new urban paradigm in regards to mass housing. We need a holistic urban vision capable of articulating the relationship of mass housing with the rest of the city, a reinstatement of the role of the public administration as an instigator of research and innovation in housing, the need to provide adequate housing to the disadvantaged, a definition of criteria for the preservation and renovation of Apartheid Tangi as a modern architectural heritage, and a renewed social role for architects. So basically I'm trying to get a job here.
Good luck.
Sorry, because I really tried to compact a lot of things into one. Little.
Oh, we have a lot of comments.
Oh no, we have to end. That's amazing how you get the screen to the screen to the screen to the screen.
Somebody write about Kuchu in condom machine.
Maybe you can just see what you have.
Any questions?
Should I
comments?
kind of? So now I'm going through the comments. And my finger doesn't scroll. Okay.
Do you?
Better.
Do you want a question?
Ask us questions.
Yeah, because I thought like you stopped at 2008, and the thing is, after 2008, everything changed. Like society changed, and the way wealth is organized is changing, and you can see it. Like there's an acceleration, right? So, like for instance, there's one thing that I missed it. Like now you see these really huge apartments for super rich, like there's like 3 new ones in Gangnam,
Yeah.
right? And they are gigantic, and inside the it's like a Baekpyeong or something. It's like it's gigantic. Also so like that's one trend that I didn't see.
Yeah.
Because I think it's post 2008. There's like splintering of like new stuff, like the super rich apartment, Baekpyeong mega apartments, right? But is there like some? I don't have. I've seen that one, and there's other stuff that's happening. Is like,
honestly,
do you have some kind of mapping
conclusion
of post 2008? Because I think it's even more interesting in a way that it's like it's changed direction, right?
Yeah,
for
totally.
so many reasons that you mentioned. So what do you see?
Actually, I haven't really looked into that because one is I had to limit at some point, and the other one is because I thought I didn't have enough distance or enough kind of way to compare or to conclude. But what I can say is that's kind of it's happening everywhere. Like all the major cities in the world, all the big metropolitan places are seeing that kind of mushrooming of super large money that gets poured into these places. I think Korea probably is still a little different because we don't get people from Saudi Arabia coming to dump the money, or Russians like it happens in England. I don't think you can do that here. So it's more like local money. But I don't think people are. I think it's more still an investment. It's not like a place to live. I think, but I don't know. Like I did interview, the Chelitus in Icheondong. Those 3 towers connected with the bridges. And I did an amazing interview because one of the ladies living there works for an American broadcasting company. So, and she actually had some role in the management of how they developed it. And it was amazing because that basically when you redevelop a Tangi, by law, if you increase the number of units of people living, there's a percentage that has to go for not public housing, but it has some social meaning. Means that you would get people who are not from your social status there. But of course, the only way to gain some benefit from that is to increase the number of units so you actually can sell them and repay the development. The people living in that old apartment Tangi decided they did not want anybody else to live with them, so they redeveloped the whole Tangi, paying for themselves. So they didn't get any benefit. You know what I mean? Like we decided to renovate. We will move out of our house for 3 years, and we will pay the construction. So you'll lose your house. You'll pay for the construction, and you will not accept any kind of benefit just because you don't want anybody else.
Incentives from the city.
Not only incentives, but you will not have new people adding money to you either. So it's and she said, we're crazy. So it was an amazing interview, and they put like the interiors are by Louis Vuitton, and there's a swimming pool. So that I think this idea of fancification becomes.
So I've seen like the Beckham apartment was like with an separate apartment, like included an apartment for servants. So now you have apartments. We have
a little apartment.
A servant's house, right? Like so, it's gigantic. It's 300 square meters, right? So, and then also you have LH. And so LH now is making these gigantic stuff.
Right. So I think since 1997. So those things before 97 was not possible, because the sizes were limited and stuff. So 97 is the beginning of that, and that's when you get Tower Palace. So like Tower Palace is kind of the icon of this kind of super rich. And I think after 2008, with the polarization of rich and poor, then it becomes even more, I think. But I don't know, I guess I'm more interested in the everyday life, and for me these things are not, like they're so far away from everyday life for me that it's kind of too far. And also, for example, I did an interview, one of the interviews I did was in Tower Palace, and that was not that big actually. And they were very defensive about questioning. Like I asked how much was, and they would not answer. How much per month do you spend? They would not answer. I couldn't put pictures of them. I couldn't put the name. So they were like highly protective and very self-aware of their status. So it was, taking pictures in the complex, forget it. So I couldn't do anything, So all the pictures I did were from neighbor, and I took a picture only from the balcony without showing them, without showing their interior, because they didn't want anybody to even be able to identify. So it becomes this very secretive thing. So I kind of gave up actually trying to do that, because I knew it was very hard.
Yul was watching the first hour because now she had to go to the next thing, and she wrote, "Wow, this is really intense research," and she can understand why you grow bored of it, so to say, after a time. And I find it fascinating. I understand why you drew the line in 2008, because in the very beginning we showed a graph how Korean society now changes, and it was designed for the Korean middle class, for this couple with the 2 children, basically, and so since 2008 we actually have a completely different situation.
I think so.
Like how actually also Europe. We were in 2000. We were in Frankfurt, and in 2000, 50% of the Frankfurt households were just single households.
Already.
50%, yeah.
That's kind of normal.
And this is now happening right now, but of course, for one person, the space use expanded, so to say, which means a lot of things can still adapt to it, but now we have a shift where actually this old apartment, you mentioned it several times, this strategy doesn't work anymore. It looks to the wrong market, and the standardization doesn't work anymore. Now we have a much more complex social structure, and the aging comes in. Now that actually these apartments are highly underdeveloped for the problems of elderly people and so on. But when you now look into the future, or from your research, do you see that Korea now adapts to these problems, or that they now develop something else? Because there comes the other line, that the people who want redevelopment, who still believe in this market of apartments to get a better economic life, they still so believe in it. So which means now actually 2008 something actually stopped, but the society drags it on, which now they build
they're still building.
But now they build something that is destined to fail, and therefore will destroy the city in which they live. Until now, the apartment improved the city in that sense. now something is built that will in the long run actually hinder the city.
You know this thing, what you say, I've heard that in 2005 or something.
Yeah,
no,
this critique is since 2000.
No, what I mean is when you say
line,
it's already, somebody would say this like, oh, peak housing, or like, it's like, and it's still going on. Like, there's less and less, like, the apartment price never stopped to grow. Like, there was like crisis and stuff. Like, peak housing is always tomorrow, right? So what I mean is it never stops. Like, that critique already is old, like it's already 20 years old.
Did he find any reaction to this critique? This critique is very old, but at one point the society or the development or Seoul has to react to it. And I know Seoul Housing built some small unit apartment for singles, and so there are certain tests with it, but there's not yet something that so you found nothing in that sense that the society.
I mean, I think that because the economy depends so much on it, that if this fails, I think Korea fails. You know, like there's so many people who depend on this thing to work. It's like Volkswagen Dieselgate.
Okay, to fail, so to say.
So I think the government is putting something, because if it fails, like the whole economy will go down. So there's it's like an artificial.
Recently, I participated to a competition, the LH, it's SH. They're doing like plenty of competition. The one that I went for was Gangil, and it was like more than 500 apartments in three, like I had 3 towers, but yeah, like I think 3 towers was standard. And so and you can see them now mushrooming everywhere.
Yeah. I honestly thought after 2008, I thought it would
like a couple of apartments or like 1 people. And
don't you see instead of the typology changing, that the user is the one that's changing? Like I see a lot of the single user grouping together to rent a big apartment. So it'll be 3 single people renting a 3-bedroom apartment rather than a family of 2. So the typology didn't change, but.
Right. I haven't seen it.
Or one thing is like now 2 people live in a place where 5 people used to live.
So I think the change of the household size. I mean, we hope that will affect the change of this apartment 단지
culture,
but the reality is something like either like Raphael said, that they either just share the apartments, one apartment, or just like you're saying about the Gangil complex, that they just make a complex for
a new one
for one person apartment. So I think and also another kind of what I see, let's say from 2008 till now, is that yes, I don't see any change of the culture,
the model, basically.
Of the model, because I think the one of the reasons why that doesn't change is that there's so much, let's say, successful examples in Gangnam model, so they rather redevelop the obsolete 단지 to a new one, so that the newer middle class can move in. So all these middle class, they have a dream to move into those areas. I think the crucial part though is that you also mentioned the Noan area, that,
for example, it's humongous.
Far north, those apartments.
Or Gwachon.
Something like that. That we know that they don't have that much locational value or advantages. What
happened there?
What happened there after 30 years, that they have to somewhat redevelop or reconstruct whatever that they do. So I think that's gonna be I don't know, like hopefully that will change the rule of the game, or probably it will still be the same.
One thing that I think would make what you say happen, like suddenly like a real crash, is that there's like population decrease. Is a real thing that never happened.
Right.
Like when the really not like when people are aging, they get richer, they have bigger apartments, so we can go and push away the peak housing, right? But when we start to really have less and less people, and the income is not rising, I think suddenly you can have a crash where suddenly everything goes down.
Right.
And the value goes to,
And
like
probably-
oil, right? The value goes to zero.
Probably that crash will happen from the marginal area of the city, and then you'll.
But see what's happening? We're discussing housing from an economic point of view, always.
Yeah, always.
You know, like it's always like this pseudo
we are already,
sociological,
in that-
but the
in that
mindset.
game, yeah.
So we never discuss spaces. We never, you know,
No,
like
that's
it always comes down always to this narrative.
But I think because it's the nature of the apartment, because apartment is cash. We don't really care, you know, like.
But that's what I mean. We should care.
Yeah, yes and no.
My point was this one. You're like, okay, forget about the economics because it's not my field. I don't know.
Yes, they get you know demolished and make again. So
I think
it's
this is
normal
part of
we
your
don't really care.
everyday thing, every day, that we talk about
The
apartment
money.
as a cash
Right.
commodity, right?
Yeah.
The
But
thing that I was
but then
so-
we're discussing things we have no clue.
Yeah, that's the
You know what I
thing.
mean? That was
No,
my claim is like
being sarcastic
when-
about this being like a commodity, apartment unit being a commodity that.
But if more than 50% of the population lives in them, you cannot like
overlook it.
Right.
Yeah, you
Like,
have to
right.
somewhat admit it
Right.
and then
Do
reflect
something
the
with it.
reality. The big shock. I don't know whether I mentioned it to you guys that the biggest shocking experiences that I had when I moved back to Korea was that when we moved in to the new apartment 2 years ago, we had to renovate some kitchen, right? And
you were
then-
living in
apartment.
but you were living in the Olympic ones, right?
Yeah, that one was my wife's
They're
grandparents.
amazing,
Yes,
right?
Yeah,
They're
it's
amazing.
It has anyway, so when I went to Hansen, like a kitchen for renovation, right, he just asked me, so, okay, where do you live? What's your unit building? So why? Because they have all the plans already. So you don't even have to draw your plan.
You have to tell them
You
nothing.
just need to tell them which neighborhood you live in and which apartment.
That's
complex
amazing.
you're in.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
It's almost like the US adopting the metric system. It'll never happen because all the construction materials are already made to fit with the
model.
And I think that I do think that there's some some fake mirage, especially for the older generations, about this apartment being a very successful investment. That we're not. So there's one model house next to my apartment. So whenever once every 6 months they change the
inside.
The brand, right? They change the inside, right? Whenever there's a new apartment brand coming in, I see old people 7 years old.
For the
6 years
opening.
old. I mean, they're the ones who always come in and then try to see what's there and then try to buy them. It's not like my generation. So it's so funny that my generation doesn't even
Because
dare
we don't
to
have the
think
money,
about-
right?
But still, the older generation they still have some investment money left or whatever. I don't know, but they're the ones who invest on all those, let's say, fake apartments, who you don't even know whether they're gonna be rented out after all, right?
But they go in 5 minutes.
They
Some
do.
but some don't.
The thing is when now there are apartment sales, you have a random lottery.
Mhm.
You have a lottery to get a ticket to enter to buy
Right,
an apartment,
right.
and it goes in 1 day.
But this was 20 years ago.
You said the Gangnam
No, I mean
apartments
today.
is
Like this happens
Can I turn the
today.
camera?
No, but
Do you think which one would you consider the Gangnam successful model? Because don't you think it's also related to the location of being in Gangnam?
Yeah.
So
The education system.
the education
Yeah,
system. So when you say the model, means
It's not architectural model. When I say successful model, it's just
Financial model.
financial model. Yeah. It's, I don't necessarily.
We
think
never
any
talk about
architectural. Yeah, we don't talk about architecture here, but yeah. So I think that's why.
The camera is this
What
one.
was it?
The camera is this
Helio City.
in Songpa.
Yeah, that also became super expensive or successful sales because of the location. Even though it's for 5,000 inhabitants, which is almost it's insane number in 2020. But
I visited a recent one that is in. My God, it was far. Like further away than Jamshid. Like Jamshid, and then beyond there's like a block of.
Maybe that's Helio City.
Maybe.
Yeah. It's a huge.
With like Y shapes, infinite, right? And some park, and it's actually quite nice.
Yeah.
I mean,
so when
you don't see a car,
right.
You know, like it has like architectural things that I think if you don't look at the colors or anything, like, I think it's pretty ugly. Like, but socially, I would understand people go there. It's gigantic. You feel protected.
You're safe.
You don't see a car.
You leave your kids out there.
Yes. There's like protection everywhere. So you have like a small lake with the frogs and stuff.
No, I mean, but that's what I was gonna get at in terms of getting back to architecture. That the model hasn't changed. Like you still have the apartment model. But when you did the sequence of studies of the public space, I think the public space or the common space within the apartment has been modified or changed to provide a better quality of life within the apartment complex. So I think that's something that's changing in terms of that these islands are.
What happens is the buildings don't change.
No, the buildings change, but the
so what changes is the landscape, because that's what you can market.
Yeah.
And the finishes, you know, like the paint, whether it's marble or but the distribution is the same.
Right.
So the ideas don't change. What changes is like how you spend them. You know, like what you can charge for.
Right.
There was.
But the lifestyle.
There was quite an interesting experiment that because of all these change of the household sizes, that they I don't know who's they, but. So they applied a unit plan that has 2 entrances.
Oh.
So you have a main entrance for, let's say, your family, and then if, let's say, your kids kind of grow up and leave, whatever, you can have, let's say, like a college kid who can
rent
a room,
right?
For them, they put a small entrance separate because you never want to share the entrance. Right, so
or you're grown up, then you wanna have privacy.
It's becoming like a mate's entrance, whatever, right? But it seems it didn't really happen much. It has some experimental units, but it never become common. I don't know why.
Like for example, I've visited in Hong Kong, and you know the Hong Kong Housing Authority, they even like they're so innovative. They're much more innovative than the market. So then they look at the tendency, like now they will be developing housing for single rooms, and basically the model the most recent model is basically an empty room. So like our idea of an LDK, when you come in, you already know when the TV is even, you know, like you don't even have the option of putting the TV somewhere else because all the cables are there. In there what happens is it's an empty shell, it's completely empty inside, and then they show you different ways in which you can distribute it inside for 2, 3, 1 people. So like, yeah, of course it should be like that. And then there's cables all around, there's no structure, there's no columns, there's no walls inside. And that's how it should, you know, like it's an empty container. But it's because it's driven by the public authorities, so they do their research. It's what the LH should be doing, you know. And then they have contacts with academia, so like the housing, the Hong Kong, they have contacts with the Hong Kong University.
Before they merged the land housing corporate. Before they merged, it was land corporate and housing corporate.
Right.
Housing corporate.
They used to. No, they have this magazine, the Chutec, and it was an amazing. Like I got so much of it, and there was a lot of research being done, but then this privatization and that's down the drain.
So I think you might have mentioned it, but I guess I'm curious about how it started out as public housing. Then when did it become privatized, or when did more of the private developers get involved with these kind of mass housing?
Yeah, that's a good question.
It was democratization.
It was part of democratization, but also I think there was a plan. Well, at the beginning, basically there were no private developers who would be able to take it. So then and nobody would believe in it either, because it was such a different way of living that nobody wanted to. So the first experiments were actually really they were actually forcing people to live in there to actually generalize it. So the first ones were targeted to, they would give like some units to artists, singers, public officers, people who were attracting like brain that were coming back, bring them back from the US. They would give them these apartments. So as a trickle down kind of strategy for people to get convinced that they should live there. So they didn't want to live there. And then it was a way to actually initiate, to change the mindset of people. The Housing Corporation was publishing this magazine that was very interesting, and they did have a center, like a housing center in downtown, where they would actually exhibit like something like this, much bigger. They were exhibiting like model houses, they were showing furniture, they were showing technical solutions, they were showing types of paints, modern kitchens. So it was a way to actually modernize people, really. And then by doing that, they can, when people started to buy in it, that's when they asked that the city kind of pushed back from being a developer, and it was more like a facilitator. So they would actually, that's what I was talking about, like the ways in which they would accumulate land. So that would be done by the city, but then they would lotify it and then give it to the private developer. So it's part of the developmental economies. Like the government facilitates, and then there's a group of people who were, not everyone could be a developer actually, so it was like only who I tell you to do, then you have a share of the market. So it's part of the private, it's the developmental strategy in a way. But then there's this shifting point where once people understand that that's the way to go, then it just goes by itself. And basically what you have to see is that the housing crisis was so big, there was such a lack of housing. It's what it's called. It's a provider's market. It's not a client market. It's not a customer market, because there's such a lack of demand that they would take whatever it comes. You know, so people don't even think there was an option, and I think still people don't think there's an option. That's why people don't think that they could have an alternative way of living. That's why, I mean, for the same price of an apartment, you can buy a very nice villa or a chutek, but they don't want it. You know, because that's not kind of the. So I think this kind of lack of options is very interesting, actually. It's part of the standardization, you know, they didn't have to do anything. Like in other places, you do have to innovate to convince people, or there's more competition, but there's no competition.
I mean, this number, it was actually impressive, this, like the one graph with 50% housing, but actually 50% since the 1930s, you know. And I think even when the New Frankfurt, like in the 20s, the social housing, there was only 20%. Like there were actually much less. Like it was a huge problem, and they needed to build social housing, but it was not 50%. There one sees how pressing this issue was, and this was the only way out of it. You know? Like there was no other way out of it.
But 50% was it squatter housing, or what was the other 50%?
Like insufficient housing.
Well, for example,
what does that mean? Like,
the example of
what's the other 50%? Is it?
Yeah, squatters.
Squatters.
But then, I mean, people renting rooms in other places, people cramming themselves in apartments.
Yeah, individual houses, no? People would do that.
But that would count under housing.
Right. So what does the informal?
Single house. You know, the one that have walls around.
Yeah.
No, but in terms of informal. But I mean, what I'm saying.
50% of the population didn't have access to their own housing.
Not own.
So
like
they had to sublet.
If they rent out.
You could rent that room.
Like these are statistics I found. I don't know. Like you have to look at what does it exactly mean. But it's not their own housing. It's housing that doesn't fulfill standards for housing.
Yeah.
So that really depends on every country, and it changes over time. But for example, the typical, like when I presented my PhD, the first question was, so the house in Parasite, what is that? You know, like the, and those typologies were the half basement, where you would build your own house, and you would already know that if you build a basement, there will be people coming from a poor place in the country that would rent it out. So those were already embedded in people, like, as a way to finance their own private house. And those are, I mean, you still can find them. They're all over the place. And there were people like, that's not proper housing by any means, you know, like, it's not hygienic. But if there was a need, so they would do it. So that's part of it. Right? You don't live in basements.
Yeah.
So it's but then it's very typical, like, after the war, there was all this housing left by the Japanese that people were occupying, people building in parks. Like, I mean, there's a huge lack of green space in Seoul because people built all over the place because there was a complete lack of housing. So it's a the thing is, though, for example,
kind of missing in your like the Daltone, which it's amazing. Like, basically every green hill we see today in Seoul was actually covered by Daltone, and then in the dictatorship they were reclaimed and militarized, as defense.
But of course, because when you go to a mountains, like everywhere, you can see like the
terracing.
Space. Yeah. Like the terracing is still there, right? In a lot of what is sun now, right? It's actually I didn't know what it was, right? But like, actually, you see the individual house, the remain, like the base is actually remaining.
Basically, like, it swamped over everything, and then in the dictatorship it was reduced again, but then it's this middle layer, so to say, that is still the Daltone layer that is actually very influential everywhere in Seoul. Like when the people went higher, and then the military took the top away. Then
there's a cap,
like on every hill, like if you fill a bathtub, this is all Daltone, and it actually has a huge impact on how we live in Seoul today.
It's funny, like, I was looking at researching in part of the research was based because in my university in Spain there's a mass housing is kind of thing, and in books from 1960s and 70s in Spanish, Daltone is called Korea. So they would say the Koreas, and it means that Daltones, there was a lot of them in Barcelona as well, but they were called Koreas back then. It was shocking.
The
informal settlement is Korea, but with a minuscule, like Koreas. So it's like, what? And it's because, like, they had this vision of Daltone completely everywhere. The problem is, like, as you said, well, it's impossible to map the informal, but the second one, because they became militarized, then it's secret. So it's very hard to we don't know. Like, there's some I've seen some maps of Daltone, but you don't know how accurate they are. It's impossible to. They are informal, so there's no number, there's no maps, there's no records. Kaja.
Okay.
Do we have to answer questions?
Scroll down a little bit. Down.
It's only you asking yourself.
What happened to public housing?
To public social housing. You said that at one point it shifted from.
Well, one thing that I think is very important is the idea of welfare, because when we white guys from Europe come here and we think about social housing, the idea, the thing is that welfare has a very different meaning. So for us, welfare is something that is outside the market system, right? It's like something that is catered for a need. There's poor people who cannot have access, so the government provides housing. In a developmental state, developmental welfare is very different because like the idea, what happens is, like, the government doesn't go and subsidize people. They subsidize your right to have housing. So actually, by allowing people to have access to a house, by building housing and selling it below the market level, that's a kind of subsidize. So it's a very different way, because then what happens here is that there is something called public housing, but then after 5 years it goes to the market. So it's not permanent. It's a very different idea. So what you have, for example, in Germany, there's people living all their lives paying 300 euros per month. So the mentality is very different, and you cannot really. But at the same time, in here, they would allow a lot of people to actually have access and then become middle class. And then they can use that apartment in their retirement, for example. No? So the meaning is very different. And there's all these kind of conceptions. That's why I wanted to talk. I had to look at what developmental really means, because it's such a different mindset of how you live that you cannot, or the idea, that's why I wanted to compare those two farmers, because the forms are the same. We're using these global forms, but actually the meanings behind them are very different. So it's very hard. No, like I have all these friends coming over and they're like, oh fuck, this is like public housing in Germany from the 20s, but it's not. But it looks like it may be. Well, so it's very hard to have all these preconceptions and to kind of get rid of that and actually understand.
But yeah, I found it interesting how you did that. Well, mentioned that point that in here it made that shift that it became to the middle class after the assassination.
No, that was in 1970. It was way before. Like they started to target the middle class because
the collapse.
After the collapse.
Because they realized they couldn't support it.
69 after the collapse.
But the interesting thing is that then I don't know how Singapore did it. I don't know how Hong Kong did it. You know.
So when is the book coming out? I buy it.
Yeah.
I'll buy it. No, seriously.
Yeah.
I like
Me too,
it.
yeah. Let's do Kickstarter.
Yeah.
Oh, so you're not done with that shit. Now you have to sell it.
No, basically now what I'm doing is each one of the 3 parts has to become an article. That's what I'm working on.
I don't know why.
Todos los diagramas son tuyos.
But that's also very
Newer. It's newer.
I don't know.
So it's a non-alcoholic meeting. Like we don't have even a beer or something.
I think I have to.
Am I the only
Okay,
one who wants
we
to
should.
do
Let's go out then.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Mark, amazing. Thank you.
Thank you
Yeah,
for putting up with
By
this.
the way.
No, you should really publish it. I mean, is it published in a journal?
You know, because I have to
And it's,
publish articles.